So, I have a question for you. Where does the legitimacy for state power come from? So, when you talk about, I'll use the words state and government interchangeably. So, think about whatever country you're in, if you're in the US, if you're in the UK, the new king in the UK at the moment. So, what justifies the state structure you have? What justifies the government? So in the US, you had the Constitution, you had the Declaration of Independence, you have all these sort of documents that you learn about early on that form the foundation of the state structure. So you had the first president of the United States, George Washington. He set a lot of precedents in his terms that following presidents adhered to and things like that. So you have physical precedents that are set down that forms part of the basis of the state structure. But what I'm talking about is actually justifying the legitimacy of it. So why should people follow what certain people say that operate within that state structure? So you have people in fancy suits, you have people with fancy titles and silly costumes and things like that, but in these different countries nowadays that supposedly have the authority to tell everyone else what to do, to make laws that dictate how people can live and what they can and can't do. That's just a basic truth that everyone implicitly acknowledges, if they even think about it at all. But they still implicitly acknowledge it. So it's a serious question, because governments are pervasive. They stick their fingers in every part of your life. How much tax you pay, how you can buy things, the money you use, all sorts of different things that a lot of people will never really think about. How you can say things nowadays. You say a certain thing, you get in trouble, you get a fine. Where you can park, what you can do, what types of products you can buy. It just goes on and on and on. So it's a bloody important question, and a very serious question to ask, where this authority comes from. Because at the end of the day, people who make up governments, even if they're very smart people, very brave or whatever, have all these good characteristics. Let's say they're the greatest people that ever lived. Let's say they're Jesus fucking Christ themselves. The question still remains, what gives these people the authority to dictate how you live? Because at the end of the day, they're still human beings. They're human beings like you and me, and so there has to be something other than naked power, naked brute force, that justifies the state, that justifies the structure, at least, that they're using to exercise power over everyone else. So it's a very valid question, and it's a very old question that's not very often asked in public discourse. Not really, it's just people just assume stuff. I think the UK at the moment is a very good case study of that. So recently, Queen Elizabeth II died in this country, and there was this predictable but still ridiculous outpouring of grief for someone that the vast majority of people, 99.99109% of people, had never even met the woman, and there was this vast unrestrained grief or feigned grief in some cases. And she was the head of state. She still was the head of state. And so you have this position where the head of state dies, and in this country the head of state isn't elected, it's not qualified in any particular way. He's just born, and he occupies a position in the line of succession, and he took over as the head of state, as the king of the United Kingdom, a king in the 21st century, in a first world country, 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. So that's the situation we have in this country. And if you're using your rational brain, if you're thinking about it very objectively, or as objectively as you can, and you look at that situation, say you're like E.T., say you're like the extraterrestrial or something, and you're hovering over Earth, and you look at that situation and go, this is an interesting system they have here in this particular part of this planet. They've had this set up for hundreds of years in one form or another, where one of them arbitrarily is the head of state. In some cases, early on in their history, they wield arbitrary power, and it is arbitrary. So you go back long enough, the very famous transition of power was with the Norman conquest. So a group of nobles led by the Duke of Normandy in 1066, Norman nobles, came over, dispossessed, we're talking in very basic terms here, dispossessed the Anglo-Saxon nobles of the time, or the Anglo-Saxon ruling elite, and so they set themselves up, and then you have this whole Anglo-Norman tradition that in one form or another exists to today. So that's the basis. And before that, you can go on ad infinitum. Before that, you had the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, and the first king was Aethelstan in 927. Before that, you had the kings of the Anglo-Saxons, the unification under Alfred and Edward, and we can go on. But when it comes down to it, the only answer we can get for the justification of this particular state system from our spacecraft in like hovering over, we're looking at it and we're thinking, well, it's just based on force, really. I mean, this bunch of humans here seem to be stronger or had an opportunity to assert themselves, and so they set themselves over other people. They have these fancy titles like Duke, and they have this strange structure, and they have this religion, and they have all these forms of control. And if the mass of people that are the followers under them don't do what they say, they essentially use violence or threats of violence, whether that's in the physical world or whether that's with threats of violence in the afterlife, like the displeasure of God or whatever. And that system was set up back then, and then it carries on to the present day, but in a very different form. But the underlying structure is there, the underlying justification that you go all the way back to that specific point in time, and violence is your answer there. So essentially violence, brute force, one set of aristocratic thugs setting up the state itself, or at least in that early form, and then it sort of lingers like a disease to the present day. And so you have the current state structure. But in this case, it's interesting because you have the same office, the office of king, so the divinely appointed king by the grace of God and all that. They even use that language, by the way. If you look at the King Charles's proclamation a couple of weeks back now, or a few days ago now, that's the language they still use, so by the grace of God. And the Ponzi guy in his stupid costume and stupid outfit looks very official, doesn't it? It looks very authentic, looks very legitimate when they get out all the pomp and ceremony, and you have the people in the stupid costumes. It's just like a courtroom in the UK. So you go in a courtroom, you have the grown men and women in those black robes and the stupid wigs on. It's just like that. And listen to the language that he uses. So you have to have all this pretentious language like my liege lord, our liege lord Charles III, by the grace of God, and all that crap. But it's interesting today because it pervades today. It's still with us in a different form. You still have this monarchy, this the basis of it being the arbitrary seizing of power at various points in the history. But is that really legitimate? That's the question. Is that really something that we can look at and go, yeah, that's the system we have, that system of government upon which all of these other institutions are based? So you have Parliament, you have a Prime Minister nowadays, you have the Cabinet and all that, you have the elections. All of that is legitimate because 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, whatever point in the monarchy you want to look at where it was established, that was when it was established, and that's the justification of power. That's it. It's just violence. So it's just the clenched fist, or in their case back then, the sword in the hand, that justifies the state ultimately that we have today. And that's the case in most places, by the way. So it's usually just the fear of force or the threat of force. A certain group of people come together, they decide arbitrarily that they're in charge, they decide that they're going to set the terms upon which everyone else is governed. It's just that in this country it's interesting, like I say, because you still have a very different form of it, but still essentially the same form. You still have a king, and you still have the religious language and very old traditional language behind it. So yeah, it's not particularly convincing to me, and I don't think it would be convincing to many thinking people. What justifies the state? What gives the state legitimacy? If you're going to have such a pervasive thing in society that affects everything, and you have this structure of control over people, it's a very important question, perhaps, possibly, arguably, even the most important societal question. What gives certain people the right to dictate what other people think? I'll talk about democracy if you want another time, but I'm just talking about the state structure itself, the whole thing that's put in place. You go back, it's like the chicken and the egg, but then you come to a point where you have to say, look, what actually gives the starting point of this process where you have this state structure in the first place. What gave those people the right to set it up in this way in the first place? It's not like 1,000 years ago there was a general consensus of whoever was living at the time, 500,000 people or whatever in the country, they all got together and said, yeah, this guy's going to be the king, he's going to start telling us what to do and all that kind of thing. I don't think that ever happened. So it's interesting to think about, and it's a very important question, and no bugger seems to have answered it in hundreds of years, or no one's given a convincing answer. Usually you just hear shit like social contract theory. In this case, in this country, it just appears to be just brute tradition. So we can look back in history to the point where it began, arguably in different places. So with the Norman conquest, with the form of monarchy we have now, perhaps before, when the earlier monarchies, the Anglo-Saxon monarchies, were set up, and maybe before that, who knows. But there comes a point where there's that initial point of violence, where the elites at the time set themselves up and they dictated how things were going to go, and then you have an evolved form of that initial set of conditions that created the proto-state, if you like, and now you have what we have now. So it's a very arbitrary thing to my mind. Is it legitimate? I'm not sure. Tell me what you think. I mean, is it a legitimate thing? Is it just something we have to accept? That most governments, most states begin in that way, that's the starting point we have and we just have to deal with it. But then, is that a satisfying answer? I don't know, you see, this is why I'm doing this video. I want to genuinely want some respectful answers, or at least some insightful answers. Tell me what you think. And yeah, hopefully this made you think about it too. Like, what really gives your government legitimacy, apart from just brute tradition? I mean, that's not an answer, is it? Oh, it's just been around forever. Just because something's been around forever doesn't mean it's necessarily legitimate, does it? That's ridiculous. It's just like, oh wow, slavery was around for thousands of years. Does that make it right? Does it make it right enslaving other human beings? Of course not. Government's been around 1,000 years. Different forms of the state have been around for a very long time. Does that mean they're necessarily legitimate? And if they're not legitimate, what are we going to do about it? Do we need to start thinking about things in a different way? So yeah, that's just what I was just getting at with this brief talk anyway. What makes government legitimate? Very important question, and one I think we need to give way more thought to. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.